My name is Caitlin Poole, 32 years old. This morning I sat across from a lawyer wearing a silk tie that cost more than a month of my rent. He pushed a legal document across the mahogany table, demanding I sign over my grandfather's lake house. 2 years, 730 days since my own parents manufactured a false medical file, telling the whole town I was a mentally unstable veteran just to disown me. In those 2 years, not a single phone call, not one message to see if I was dead or alive. And now, when their precious golden girl has gone bankrupt, they find me. Not to apologize. They hired a lawyer to strip away the last memory my grandfather left for me. They think 10 years in the army only taught me how to follow orders. But they forgot. I am a logistics officer. Before I show you how a 7-year-old piece of paper crushed the pride of that hypocritical bank manager, let me know which state you're listening from, hit subscribe, and get your ammunition ready. The mahogany table in the law office was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights above in a way that made my head throb. I am a logistics officer. I am trained to observe the terrain, to spot the structural weaknesses in a supply line, and to recognize the exact moment a situation shifts from a negotiation into an ambush. Right now, Lawyer Brennan was the primary obstacle on the tactical map. He sat there in his expensive suit, his silk tie shimmering with an oily luster, tapping the end of a heavy fountain pen against the wood. Click, click, click. The sound was dry and hollow, echoing through the silent office like bone hitting bone. He didn't look at me. Instead, he chose to stare at a fixed point somewhere in the empty space between my left shoulder and the edge of the desk. A classic avoidance tactic. He cleared his throat, a wet, grating sound, and pushed a cheap plastic ballpoint pen toward me. The gesture was a calculated insult, a stark contrast to the gold-nibbed instrument he kept for himself. "Sign here, Captain," he said, his voice as thin and lifeless as the paper he wanted me to ruin. The room smelled like stale, lukewarm black coffee and that synthetic, industrial lemon-scented air freshener used in places that have something to rot under the surface. I pulled the legal notification toward me, my index finger tracing the razor-sharp edge of the high-grade vellum. The words, "Quitclaim Deed," were printed in a bold, soulless font at the top of the page. Below that, the address that made my stomach turn. 14 Cedar Mill Road. My grandfather's sanctuary. At the bottom of the page, the signature was already waiting for me, mocking my silence. Gerald Poole, my father. He had signed his name in aggressive blue ink, pressing so hard into the fiber that the tip of the pen had nearly shredded the paper. The indentation was so deep it bled through to the back, leaving a physical scar on the document. That was Gerald's signature style, leaving a bruise on everything and everyone he touched. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen flickered to life, the harsh blue light cutting through the dim office. I opened my call history and navigated to the search bar. I typed in Gerald. No results. I typed in Diane. Blank. 730 days. That was the exact agonizing count since the people who gave me life last spoke to me. 2 full years of total radio silence. During those 730 days, they hadn't been idle. While I was rebuilding my life, they had been busy operating a smear campaign in our small Knoxville circle. They told the church group and the neighbors that I was unstable, that the shadows of my service had broken something inside me that couldn't be repaired. They weaponized my sacrifice to justify their abandonment, turning my trauma into a reason to shun me. Yet here we were. They couldn't spare a single minute for a welfare check, but they were more than happy to pay $500 an hour for a stranger to liquidate the only thing I had left in this world. Brennan adjusted his designer frames with a nervous twitch of his hand. He looked down at a yellow legal pad, huffing a dry, practiced breath. My client, Mr. Poole, is currently finalizing a home equity line of credit. A HELOC, Brennan began, his voice taking on the scripted, condescending tone of a man used to talking down to people. He needs to mortgage the lake house to cover the catastrophic liquidation costs of your sister Meredith's interior design business. He specifically asked me to convey a message to you, Captain. He said he hopes you will be compliant given the difficult family situation. Compliant. The word felt like rusted copper in my mouth. To a soldier, compliance is about structure, safety, and mutual trust. To Gerald Poole, it was a code word for subservient. It was the linguistic leash he had used for 20 years to keep me quiet while Meredith was treated like the golden child. Meredith got the new cars, the expensive lessons, and the infinite grace to fail at every vanity project she touched. Now, after burning through their retirement savings, she was reaching for my grandfather's legacy to cover her latest disaster. The word family coming out of Brennan's mouth sounded like a slur, a dirty trick used by people who only remembered my existence when they needed a check signed. I leaned back into the executive leather chair, feeling the material groan and protest beneath my weight. I deliberately forced my shoulders to drop, exhaling the cold tension I'd carried since I stepped into this trap. And then, a sound escaped my throat. A laugh? It was dry, raspy, and completely devoid of joy. The sound of a person who had seen the bottom of the well and found it filled with snakes. Brennan flinched. He actually dropped his fountain pen, and it clattered loudly onto the carpeted floor. He stared at me with wide, panicked eyes, looking at me as if the mentally unstable rumors were finally manifesting as a psychotic break right in front of him. He thought I was breaking under the weight of his legal threats. He thought the pressure of Gerald's demands had finally snapped my military resolve. He didn't realize I wasn't laughing because I was losing my mind. I was laughing because I finally saw the trap for exactly what it was: a desperate, pathetic reach for power by people who had already lost their grip. Gerald Poole had spent 2 decades molding me into a stoic, telling me I was the resilient one who didn't need support, just so he could funnel every cent to his favorite child. He thought he had sculpted me into a tool that would always yield to his pressure. He was so certain I would sign. He was so sure that the woman who survived a decade of military discipline would crumble before a piece of paper and a fake plea for family unity. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto that sharp, jagged signature at the bottom of the deed. It was more than a name. It was a blade aimed at my life. As I stared at that aggressive blue ink, the walls of the law office seemed to blur and dissolve. The scent of cheap lemon cleaner vanished, replaced by the heavy, suffocating humidity of a Tennessee summer. I could almost hear the rhythmic, maddening sound of the cicadas in the trees back home. That signature acted like a hook, dragging my consciousness out of the office and pulling me down the long, dark road toward the house in Knoxville where the first betrayal began. That jagged blue signature at the bottom of the deed didn't just represent a legal threat, it was a time machine. As I stared at the way the ink bled into the grain of the paper, the sterile air of the law office vanished. I wasn't 32 anymore. I was back in Knoxville, standing on a lawn so green and manicured it looked fake, under a sun that felt like a heavy, humid blanket. It was the morning of Meredith's 16th birthday, and the air was thick with the scent of freshly cut grass and the looming shadow of my own invisibility. I can still hear the jingle of the keys. Gerald didn't just give them to her. He tossed them through the air like a trophy. They had a massive red silk bow attached to the ring. Meredith caught them, her blonde hair shimmering in the light, and let out a scream that probably reached the next county. Behind her sat a brand-new, charcoal-gray Honda Civic. The engine turned over, a crisp, mechanical purr that sliced through the quiet of our suburban neighborhood. Gerald stood there, his chest puffed out with a pride he had never shown for me, laughing as he pulled her into a hug. I stood 20 feet back, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of a denim jacket I'd bought at a thrift store with money I earned, scrubbing grease off engine blocks at the local gas station. I leaned against our ebony-stained fence, watching the scene like a stranger peering through a window. I wondered what the interior of that car smelled like. I knew it was fresh leather and new car scent, but I'd never know for sure. During that entire year, I was never once invited to sit in the passenger seat. In our family, Meredith was the pilot, and I was the ghost in the rearview mirror. My own 16th birthday, 3 years prior, had been a very different affair. There were no keys, there was no lawn party. There was only a thin, white envelope sitting next to a bowl of fruit on the kitchen island. Inside was a monthly city bus pass and a page from the local newspaper with the Help Wanted section circled in red. I was being told to find a job as a cashier. Diane was in the kitchen, her Bible open on the granite counter next to the sink. She was peeling a Granny Smith apple, the blade of the knife moving with terrifying precision. She didn't look up when I opened the envelope. She just smiled that soft, practiced smile, the one she used at her Bible study to make everyone believe she was a saint. "The house is a little tight this year, Caitlin," she said, the crunch of her biting into an apple slice echoing in the silence. "We've had to put a significant deposit down on Meredith's new Steinway. She has a gift, and we must nurture it. But God gave you such strong legs and a spirit of independence. You've always been our resilient one. You must learn to share the burden of this family." She swallowed the apple, her eyes remaining fixed on the scripture in front of her. She didn't look at me once, not to see the disappointment, not to acknowledge the sting of being cast aside. To her, my strength wasn't a virtue. It was a convenience that allowed her to ignore me. I was a glass child, perfectly transparent, existing only to reflect the light onto her golden daughter. The word resilient became the spell Gerald used to lock me out of the family treasury. A few months later, when I asked for $40 to buy an advanced biology textbook, he didn't even look up from the television. He was sitting on his leather sofa, legs crossed, his eyes glued to the flickering green and red numbers of the stock market ticker on the news. "Meredith is sensitive, Caitlin. She needs a support system. She needs to feel secure to practice her music," he muttered, his voice cold and final. "But you're a survivor. You're like a desert cactus. You could be dropped in the middle of nowhere and you'd find a way to bloom. You don't need the water we give her." That was the moment I realized that in his eyes, I wasn't a daughter. I was a piece of equipment that didn't require maintenance. I was a self-sustaining asset that cost him nothing. Being resilient meant I wasn't worth a single cent of his resources. The final insult came when they decided the master guest suite, my bedroom, was too large for just one person. They needed a dedicated music room for Meredith's grand piano. I was told to move my life into the small windowless utility room next to the laundry area. I remember lying in that room at 2 o'clock in the morning. The walls were thin drywall, and every time the industrial-sized washing machine hit the spin cycle, the entire room would shake. The metal drum would hammer against the wall right behind my head. A rhythmic, violent thud that made my teeth rattle. I would pull the thin wool blanket over my head, biting my lower lip until I tasted blood just to keep from crying. I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single tear. If they wanted me to be a cactus, I would be the sharpest one they'd ever touched. I stared at those vibrating walls and made a vow to the rhythm of the machine. I promised myself I would leave Knoxville. I would find a world where resilience was a badge of honor, not an excuse for neglect. I would earn my own way, and one day, I would put on a uniform that commanded the respect my own father refused to give me. Before we continue into the day I finally escaped that house, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? Have you ever had your strength used as an excuse for people to stop caring about your needs? If you've ever felt like you were standing on the outside of your own life, please hit the like button to support this story and comment, "I see you," below. It's a small way to let others in this community know they aren't alone in their silence. Back in the law office, I looked up from the deed. My hand was steady, but my heart was a cold, hard stone. Brennan was still waiting for me to sign away my grandfather's home. He thought he was dealing with a compliant daughter who would roll over for the sake of family. He didn't realize that the girl who spent her nights listening to the laundry machine hammer against the wall had grown up to be a woman who knew exactly how to dismantle an enemy from the inside out. It was exactly 5:30 in the morning when the hiss of the steam iron filled my cramped apartment. I sprayed the heavy starch onto my blue uniform trousers, the white mist settling over the fabric like a promise. I pressed the iron down, holding it until the heat seared through, creating a crease so sharp it could cut skin. This wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was 4 years of my life. It was 25 hours a week at a gas station, smelling like diesel and stale cigarettes, while my classmates were at frat parties. It was the grueling, bone-deep exhaustion of ROTC ruck marches, through the Tennessee mud before the sun even dared to rise. Every stitch of this Class A uniform was paid for in sweat and blood. Literally. I spent the next hour with a tin of Brasso and a rag, buffing the brass buttons and the second lieutenant bars until they mirrored my own hollow reflection. I polished my black leather shoes until my knuckles bled, the sharp, medicinal tang of the polish filling my lungs. Today was the commissioning ceremony. For the first time in history, the Poole family had an officer. I thought, perhaps, that the weight of the gold on my shoulders would finally be enough to make Gerald see me. At 7 o'clock, the phone on my dresser began to vibrate with a violent, mechanical persistence. I saw the name Gerald flash on the screen. I took a deep breath, clearing the nervous lump in my throat before sliding the answer bar. I expected a congratulations, or perhaps a we're on our way. Instead, the first thing I heard was the sharp, rhythmic snap of packing tape and Gerald's frustrated grunt. "Sit, Rep," he barked, as if my life was just another task on his checklist. "We aren't going to make it, Caitlin. Meredith's new apartment had a pipe burst, and she's a wreck. She's been on the phone crying for an hour. I've got to go over there and help her move her designer rugs before they're ruined." In the background, I heard the wet, rhythmic smack of Diane chewing gum. "It's just a pinning ceremony, honey," she chimed in, her voice light and dismissive, as if I were getting a participation trophy at a middle school track meet. "You've always been so independent anyway. You can handle a few photos on your own. Try not to be so dramatic about it." Then came the long, flat hum of the dial tone. It was a sound that cut off my air faster than any gas mask ever could. The auditorium was a sea of polished brass and weeping families. I stood at attention, my back a rigid line of steel, as the names were called. Second Lieutenant Caitlin Poole. My boots struck the floor with a hollow, rhythmic thud as I marched toward the stage. From the corner of my eye, I saw the rows of families. Fathers in their Sunday best, mothers clutching bouquets of lilies, siblings fighting over who got to take the first photo. Then I saw it. Section P. 3. Folding chairs sat there, cold and velvet-backed, glaringly empty. They looked like 3 tombstones in the middle of a celebration. My commanding officer stepped forward to pin the gold bars onto my shoulders. He looked for my parents, his eyes searching the crowd for the people who were supposed to be there to witness my transition from cadet to officer. He saw nothing but the void. I didn't flinch. I kept my eyes locked on a point in the far distance, a space where the air was thin and the light was cold. I raised my hand in a crisp, sharp salute, my arm trembling slightly from the sheer effort of holding my world together. My jaw was clenched so tight the muscles in my face began to ache with a dull, throbbing intensity. I wasn't a daughter today. I was an island, surrounded by a tide of people who had a home to go to. By 6 o'clock that evening, the adrenaline had vanished, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. I sat on the floor of my room, still in my uniform, and began to unlace my boots. I threw them into the corner, the sound of the leather hitting the floor echoing like a gunshot. The phone rang again. I almost didn't answer it. But then I saw the caller, ID, Howard, my grandfather. His voice came through the line, raspy and interrupted by a wet, hacking cough that told me the years were catching up to him. "Caitlin, I saw the photo you sent," he whispered, his voice thick with a pride that made my eyes burn. "You look formidable, kid. Truly sharp." He paused, his breath hitching. "I'm sorry about Gerald. He's always been blind to the gold in front of him because he's too busy chasing the glitter. But listen to me carefully. Don't look back at them. Don't wait for a salute they'll never give. You keep moving. I've already established the safety perimeter for you. You're covered, Caitlin. You hear me? You're covered." I wiped a stray tear away with the back of my hand, nodding into the empty room. I didn't understand the full weight of his words then. I didn't know that while my parents were planning to bury me, my grandfather had already been digging the trenches to protect me. I just sat there in the dark, a brand new officer with a broken heart, holding on to the sound of the only man who truly saw me. I met Daniel when I was 26 years old, and he didn't arrive with a resume or a trust fund. He arrived with grease under his fingernails and a layer of grit on his skin. My truck had died on a stretch of highway under a sun so brutal it felt like the sky was made of molten lead. He was just a man who pulled over, a stranger who didn't ask for anything before he crawled under my chassis. When he finally emerged, shirtless and drenched in sweat that smelled of engine oil and raw effort, I saw the scars. Thick, raised keloids from shrapnel wounds mapped across his shoulders, souvenirs from his time as an army sapper, a combat engineer who had spent his youth clearing paths through minefields. He didn't have the manicured hands of the bank managers or the silky smooth voices of the men Gerald had spent my entire life trying to push me toward. Daniel was raw, solid, and made of the kind of blue-collar iron that doesn't bend under pressure. When he reached out to pull me up from the mud after a sudden roadside downpour, his grip was a revelation. It wasn't the tentative, calculated touch I was used to. It was the anchored weight of someone who knew exactly how to keep a person from falling. Our first date was a disaster by Knoxville standards. He was 45 minutes late because a cable-pulling job on a new construction site had run over schedule. He didn't pull up in a luxury sedan. He arrived in a bruised Ford F-15. Oh, that was more red mud than white paint. He jumped out of the cab, breathless and still wearing his work boots, and shoved a bundle of yellow wildflowers into my hands. The petals were bright, almost blindingly gold, but half of them were crushed and wilting. They were wrapped in a stained section of newspaper he'd grabbed in a hurry at a gas station. "I'm sorry," he panted, rubbing the back of his neck with a hand that was still stained with electrical conduit dust. "The job went sideways. I pulled these from the side of the highway because I didn't want to show up empty-handed." I looked at those dying weeds and the man who had risked the Tennessee traffic just to bring me something beautiful. And for the first time in 26 years, my throat tightened with a real, aching warmth. In my world, love was a transaction. It was something you earned by being resilient and compliant. But Daniel had run himself ragged just to ensure he didn't miss a single second of my time. The wedding was a small, quiet affair in a park, but my parents treated it like a funeral for their social status. Gerald and Diane arrived 30 minutes late, dressed in attire better suited for a red carpet gala than a grassy clearing. They moved through the guests like they were visiting a homeless shelter, their smiles tight and painted on. During the reception, we sat at a long wooden table under the oak trees. Gerald sat across from us, swirling a glass of expensive red wine he'd insisted on bringing himself. His eyes narrowed as they traced the lines of Daniel's rented tuxedo. The suit was a little too tight in the shoulders, straining against Daniel's build. Gerald picked up his silver fork, and the sound of the metal scraping against the fine china was a rhythmic, agonizing shriek, a sensory assault that made everyone at the table flinch. "So, Daniel," Gerald began, his voice dripping with that high society condescension that always preceded a strike. "A residential electrician. Interesting choice for a veteran." He let out a soft, mocking snicker as he took a sip of his wine. "I really thought the military would have broadened Caitlin's horizons, given her the opportunity to find an officer of rank, or perhaps someone with a proper graduate degree. I never imagined she would settle for someone who spends their life crawling through sewers and wiring basements." Diane sat beside him, covering her mouth with a lace handkerchief as she giggled, her eyes cold and judgmental. The table went dead silent. I felt the familiar heat of shame rising in my chest, that old urge to just be stoic and let the insult pass for the sake of peace. But Daniel wasn't a Poole. He didn't play the game of quiet submission. I felt his hand, heavy, warm, and scarred, press firmly down on my shoulder, anchoring me to my seat. He didn't shout. He didn't lose his temper. He simply picked up his glass of beer and set it down on the wooden table with a slow, deliberate thud that sounded like a gavel. He leaned forward, his eyes burning with a dark, dangerous intensity as he locked onto my father's face. "Listen to me, Mr. Poole," Daniel said, his voice low and vibrating with a level of authority that made the hair on my arms stand up. "I don't give a damn if you respect the work I do. My hands are dirty so that my life can be clean, and I sleep just fine at night." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over my father's plate. "But from this moment on, you will respect my wife. You will speak to her with the dignity she earned in uniform, or I will personally shut the door on this relationship and lock it from the inside." Gerald froze, his mouth slightly open, the wineglass trembling in his hand as the smug smile vanished from his face. He looked at Daniel and saw, for the first time, a man he couldn't intimidate with a bank statement or a Bible verse. The air between them was thick with a new kind of tension, the declaration of a psychological war that had been brewing for decades. As we sat there in the fading Tennessee light, I realized that my grandfather had been right. He had set the perimeter, but Daniel was the one who was going to hold the line. I wasn't an island anymore. I had an ally who was willing to get his hands dirty to protect my peace, and I knew, looking at the fury in my father's eyes, that the Pooles would never forgive us for that. The Christmas block leave was supposed to be a strategic pause in the long-standing hostility of the Poole household, a designated time for the gears of family life to reset. In the Army, we value these breaks for the sake of readiness, but as I stood at the kitchen sink that evening, I realized I had walked straight into a prepared ambush. I kept my head down, scrubbing a heavy roasting pan while the water, which was supposed to be hot, ran ice cold against my skin. It felt like dozens of frozen needles were stitching into my fingers, but I didn't pull away. I was practiced in the art of enduring discomfort. Outside the window, the Tennessee snow was beginning to blanket the driveway in a deceptive, peaceful white, but inside, the air was thick with the suffocating, heavy smell of a turkey that had been left in the oven 5 minutes too long. The kitchen door swung shut behind me with a soft, ominous click that signaled the start of an interrogation. Meredith was there, leaning against the granite counter, her eyes already wide and damp with a practiced, shallow sorrow. She didn't ask about my latest deployment or if the transition back to civilian life was as difficult as the news claimed. She didn't care about my rank or my service. She simply reached out and tugged at the sleeve of my sweater, her voice a fragile, rehearsed whisper that set my teeth on edge. "Caitlin, I need you to lend me $5,000, she said, her tone as casual as if she were asking for a cup of sugar. "The boutique is struggling with the new inventory. Dad and Mom are tapped out from helping me with the rent last month, and you're the only one in the family with a steady, guaranteed government paycheck." I stopped scrubbing. I looked at her, really looked at her. At the expertly applied eyeliner, the pristine manicure, and the designer jeans that cost more than my entire month's grocery budget. This was her third emergency in 2 years. $10,000 of my hard-earned savings had already vanished into the black hole of her entrepreneurial dreams, and I hadn't seen a single dime of it back. I shook her hand off my arm and threw the damp dish towel into the sink with a wet, final thud. "No," I said, my voice as flat and unyielding as a dial tone. "Not another cent, Meredith. If your business is failing, go get a real job at a grocery store and earn the money yourself." The transformation was instantaneous and terrifyingly precise. She didn't argue. She didn't plead for understanding. She simply stepped back 2 paces, her lower lip beginning to tremble with the mechanical accuracy of a stage actress. She let out a sharp, jagged scream, the kind of sound that suggests a physical assault, and then she scrambled out toward the living room. By the time I followed her, she'd collapsed onto the white leather sofa, sobbing into her hands so violently that her expensive mascara began to streak down her face in dark, ugly rivers of artificial grief. 15 people, aunts, uncles, and cousins, stopped mid-bite. The cheerful sound of tearing wrapping paper died instantly, replaced by a heavy, accusatory silence. Gerald didn't even ask for my side of the story. He threw his newspaper onto the glass coffee table with a sound like a gunshot and surged to his feet like a pressurized spring. He marched toward me, his face turning a dark, bruised purple, and shoved a thick, blunt finger inches from my nose. "What kind of sister are you, Caitlin?" he hissed, his voice vibrating with a performative, patriarchal rage. "Your own flesh and blood is drowning, and you just stand there with that cold, heartless look on your face? You've changed. You've turned into something unrecognizable and cruel." The whispers started immediately, a low, buzzing hum of judgment that filled the room. Then came Diane. She walked out from the dining room, still holding a silver platter of charred turkey, her expression one of saintly, agonizing pity. She set the tray down on the table under the harsh, blinding glare of the crystal chandelier and sighed, a long, dramatic sound that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. "She's been like this ever since she married that electrician," Diane said, her voice loud enough to reach the neighbors. She turned to Aunt Linda, her eyes welling with fake tears as she tilted her head. "I'm terrified, Linda. I think the military environment finally broke her. I think she's lost her mind. It's the PTSD, she's unstable, aggressive, and clearly lacks empathy. She needs to see a military doctor immediately before she hurts herself or one of us." The air in the room turned to ice. 15 pairs of eyes were fixed on me, but they weren't looking at a daughter or a decorated officer anymore. They were looking at a ticking time bomb, a monster who had been warped by service into something dangerous and subhuman. Not a single person spoke up in my defense. Not one uncle who had bragged about my rank at the 4th of July barbecue. Not one cousin who had asked me for army gear. It was the silence of the sheep, a collective betrayal that felt more painful than any physical wound I had ever endured. I stood there, my jaw locked so tight I thought my teeth might shatter under the pressure. I felt the old stoic discipline trying to take over, trying to find a way to apologize just to make the screaming stop. But then I felt a hand on my shoulder, warm, steady, and completely unyielding. Daniel was there. He had been standing in the corner, silently watching the entire ambush unfold with the eyes of a man who knew exactly how to handle a minefield. He didn't engage with Gerald's purple-faced rage. He didn't dignify Diane's lies with a response. He simply pushed his chair back, a sharp screeching sound that tore through the heavy silence of the room like a serrated blade. He grabbed my coat from the rack and draped it over my shaking shoulders with a calm, protective grace. "We're leaving," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that commanded the room more effectively than any officer I'd ever known. I didn't look back at Meredith's fake tears or Gerald's trembling finger. I walked past my father, brushing his outstretched arm aside with a force that made him stumble against the coffee table, and pushed through the front door. The cold Tennessee air hit my face, sharp, honest, and clean. The snow was falling in thick white curtains, bearing the tracks of our car and the hypocrisy of the house behind me. As the door clicked shut for the last time, I knew the block leave was over. The war at home had officially begun, and this time I wasn't just surviving, I was preparing to fight back. I was no longer a Poole. I was a soldier who had finally identified the real enemy. The silence that followed the heavy click of that front door in the snow was not the sound of peace. It was the sound of a Cold War beginning. I stood in the driveway of my parents' house for the last time, watching the Tennessee winter bury my footprints, knowing that the family I had fought to protect was now the very enemy I had to survive. The Poole smear campaign didn't wait for the ice to melt. It began within 48 hours. Rachel, my cousin and the only person in that circle who still possessed a shred of a conscience, secretly sent me a digital audio recording a week later. I sat in the dark of my apartment, the only sound being the distant rhythmic drone of a neighbor's lawnmower. That quintessential American suburban hum that usually signals safety, but now felt like a warning. I hit play. Gerald's voice crackled through the speaker, nasal and high-pitched, vibrating with the practiced tremor of a suffering father. He was talking to Jim, the owner of the gas station where I'd worked 60-hour weeks to pay for my own education. "Jim, it's Gerald Poole," he began, his voice dripping with a fake, heavy sorrow. "I'm calling because I'm terrified for Caitlin. She's been so unstable since she got back. The military changed her, Jim. Her mental health is in a dark place, and we think she might be a danger to herself or the people around her. I just thought you should know, in case she comes looking for her old shift back." He wasn't checking on me. He was poisoning the well. He was weaponizing the very service I was proud of, using the word unstable like a scalpel to cut off my ability to earn a living. He wanted me homeless. He wanted me starving so I would eventually crawl back to Knoxville on my knees, begging for his mercy and his forgiveness. The glass I was holding didn't just slip, I crushed it. The shards bit into my palm, but I didn't feel the pain, only the cold metallic taste of fury rising in my throat. I didn't call him to scream. I didn't give him the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Instead, I did what any officer does when a position becomes untenable. I executed a permanent change of station. The next morning, I filed my PCS paperwork. The Army approved my transfer to Fort Campbell, just 45 minutes away from the poison of my hometown. It was far enough to build a fortress, but close enough to watch the horizon for their next move. I changed my phone number. I scrubbed every trace of my life from social media and blocked every person with the last name Poole. I slammed the iron door on that world and locked it from the inside. 2 years passed in a blur of duty and discipline. Time in the military is measured in rank and rotations. I was promoted to captain, a logistics officer who finally knew how to manage her own internal supply lines. Daniel, my rock, had stayed by my side, his scarred hands building the foundation of a life my parents couldn't touch. He won 2 major electrical contracts for the county, and together we bought a small patch of dirt. We didn't hire a crew. We shingled the roof ourselves in the Tennessee heat. We pulled the copper wiring through the studs together. In the evenings, I would sit on our new porch, the smell of fresh cedar pine mingling with the scent of Daniel's work clothes, oil, sweat, and honest labor. I would sit there with a stiff brush, scrubbing the dried mud from my combat boots. Sometimes I'd hear a neighbor's laughter from a weekend barbecue or see a father teaching his daughter to ride a bike, and the salt of a stray tear would hit the corner of my mouth. The wound of being discarded by your own blood never truly closes. It just becomes a scar you learn to live with. But the silence of my new home allowed me to breathe. I no longer had to sleep with one eye open, waiting for the next knife to find its way into my back. But that peace was shattered this morning. I blinked, my focus snapping back to the present, back to the sterile, mahogany-filled office of Lawyer Brennan. The smell of the cheap lemon-scented air freshener was suddenly suffocating again. My eyes drifted back down to the quitclaim deed lying on the desk. I stared at Gerald's signature, that jagged, ego-driven ink that looked like a row of broken teeth. He thought 2 years of silence had broken me. He thought that by ignoring my existence, he had drained my will to fight. He thought this single piece of paper would terrify a captain in the United States Army. If you've ever had to block someone you love just to keep your sanity, hit that like button right now. It is not an act of hate, it is an act of survival. Comment: boundary below if you finally built your own wall of peace and refused to let the people who hurt you back inside. I looked at Brennan, who was still checking his watch and tapping his expensive pen. I didn't say a word. I simply leaned forward, the corners of my mouth twitching into a smirk that didn't reach my eyes. My hand moved toward the zipper of my leather bag. Gerald Poole thought he was the one setting the trap. He had no idea that I had spent the last 2 years gathering the intelligence that was about to turn his entire world into a pile of ash. I gripped the handle of my bag, the sound of the zipper sliding open echoing like the chambering of a round. It was time to show them what happens when you try to steal from a soldier who has nothing left to lose. The first email from Lawyer Brennan hit my inbox like a tracer round cutting through the darkness of a quiet Tuesday evening. It wasn't just a formal request. It was a tactical threat wrapped in expensive, high-gloss legalese. He was giving me exactly 24 hours to sign the quitclaim deed for 14 Cedar Mill Road, or face a protracted and public litigation that he claimed would jeopardize my standing as a captain in the United States Army. I didn't panic, and I didn't reach for my phone to call Gerald. I simply closed my laptop, stood up, and grabbed a heavy iron flashlight. I made my way down to the basement of the house Daniel and I had built together. The air down there was cool, carrying the scent of damp concrete and the raw, honest smell of curing wood. I moved past the workbench and the stacks of Daniel's electrical spools until I reached the back corner, where a heavy antique chest sat under a thick layer of gray dust. This was Grandpa Howard's cedar box. He had left it to me in his will 7 years ago with a single, cryptic instruction. Only open this when they have finally backed you into a corner, Caitlin. When the perimeter is about to break. I knelt on the cold concrete floor, my knees making a dry clicking sound in the silence. As I wiped away the dust, the rich, pungent aroma of cedar wood surged up, hitting my nostrils like a physical weight. It was the scent of my childhood summers spent on the lake, the smell of old wool army blankets, and the memory of the only man who had ever looked at me and seen a warrior instead of a convenient, resilient tool. My hands trembled slightly as I worked the heavy brass latch. I reached past the old photographs and the folded American flag from his casket to the very bottom, where a thick brown manila envelope lay hidden. It was reinforced with heavy-duty packing tape, crisscrossed in a specific security pattern. I used my pocket knife to slice through the reinforced tape, the sound of the paper tearing echoing through the empty basement like a jagged, final breath. Inside the envelope was a stack of heavy legal documents and a single, yellowed, sticky note. The handwriting was shaky, the loops of the letters irregular and vibrating, the unmistakable mark of the Parkinson's disease that had slowly stolen Grandpa Howard's strength. "Caitlin," the note began, "I know your father. He means well in his own twisted, ego-driven way, but he is blinded by that sister of yours. He thinks he can redistribute the world to suit his favorites. But this lake house is yours. It has always been yours. Do not let them tell you otherwise, and do not you dare give it up to pay for another one of Meredith's expensive delusions. I have already set the safety catch. Love, Grandpa H." I sank back onto my heels, the cold of the basement floor seeping through my jeans, and for the first time in 2 long years, the dam finally broke. Hot, thick tears spilled over, splashing onto the dusty floor in heavy, rhythmic drops. I sobbed. Not out of a sense of weakness, but out of the sheer, overwhelming realization that I had never been as alone as I thought. Even from the grave, the old man had been standing guard over my flank, holding the line against the people who were supposed to love me. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand and began to flip through the legal papers with the focused intensity of an officer reviewing intelligence. It wasn't a standard will. It was something far more powerful. It was a certificate of irrevocable trust. 3 years before his death, Grandpa Howard had moved the property at 14 Cedar Mill Road entirely out of his personal estate and into a private, protected trust. The sole beneficiary listed in bold black type was Caitlin Ellen Poole. The trustee was a man named Lawyer Calloway, a fierce old veteran advocate based in Nashville. In the eyes of American law, an irrevocable trust meant the property was no longer part of the Poole family legacy. Gerald didn't own it. Diane didn't own it. It wasn't theirs to sell, to mortgage, or to use as collateral. Gerald's attempt to sell that house for $320,000 wasn't just a family dispute. It was a massive federal-level act of wire fraud. He was trying to liquidate an asset that he didn't even have the legal right to stand on. This morning, as I was putting on my blazer to head to Brennan's office, my phone buzzed. It was Rachel, my cousin. Her voice was a frantic, low-volume whisper. "Caitlin, you didn't hear this from me," she breathed, her voice shaking. "But the bank foreclosed on Meredith's boutique yesterday. She is completely wiped out. And Gerald? He is desperate. He secretly took out a second mortgage on his own house to cover a $180,000 debt for her last month, thinking he would just pay it off once he forced you to sell the lake house. If he doesn't get that money from you today, the bank is going to take his home too. He's standing on the edge of a cliff, Caitlin, and he's planning to push you off just to save his own skin." I clicked the phone shut, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. I slid the certified copy of the trust documents, complete with the red embossed seal of the county clerk, into my black leather briefcase. I zipped it shut, the sound of the metal teeth interlocking like the chambering of a round in a service pistol. I wasn't just going to a meeting. I was going on a hunt. Gerald Poole had spent decades trying to convince me I was a desert cactus that didn't need water. He was about to find out that a cactus has spines, and I was about to bury every single one of them in his pride. I stood up, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the door. The Tennessee sun was rising, and for the first time in my life, the air smelled like victory. My grandfather had set the trap, and today, I was the one who was going to spring it. Lawyer Brennan was tapping his index finger against the mahogany desk, a sharp rhythmic sound that reminded me of a ticking clock on a bomb. "Time is money, Captain," he muttered, checking his gold watch for the 3rd time in 10 minutes. I didn't respond. I sat there with my spine as straight as a bayonet, my eyes fixed on the door. I knew the real enemy wasn't this hired gun in the silk tie. I was waiting for the commander of this failed operation to show his face and witness his own defeat. The heavy oak door finally swung open, and Gerald Poole stepped into the room. He didn't just walk in, he occupied the space with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed the world was his private bank vault. He was wearing a crisp, pale blue Ralph Lauren button-down shirt, perfectly pressed, and his silver hair was slicked back with expensive pomade. He smelled like cedarwood cologne and unearned confidence. He didn't look at me as a daughter. He looked at me as a problematic inventory item that was refusing to be liquidated for his benefit. Gerald pulled out the leather chair opposite me and sat down, crossing his legs and leaning back with a patronizing sigh. "Sign the papers, Caitlin," he started, his voice thick with that fake, fatherly concern that used to make me crumble when I was a child. "Just sign them. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. The economy is brutal right now, and the family is facing a real crisis. Your grandfather Howard would have wanted us to protect your sister. Meredith is fragile, Caitlin. She's not built like you. She needs this lake house to clear her debts and start over. You're the resilient one, remember? You'll always be fine on your own." Hearing him use Grandpa Howard's name to justify his theft was like watching someone spit on a fallen soldier's grave. It was a level of disrespect that turned my blood into liquid nitrogen. I looked at him, my expression a blank mask of military discipline. "Is that right, Gerald?" I asked, my voice low and dangerously steady. "You're invoking the name of a man you haven't even visited in the cemetery for 3 years just to help you steal my inheritance? That is a new low, even for you." Before he could answer, his phone began to vibrate on the table with a violent, mechanical persistence. He didn't silence it. Instead, he smirked and hit the speakerphone button, sliding the device toward the center of the desk like a pawn in a chess match. Meredith's voice erupted into the room, high-pitched and grating, echoing off the expensive wood. "Dad? Dad, did she sign it yet?" she wailed, her voice thick with forced, nasal tears. "The bank called again this morning. They're threatening to come to the boutique. Please tell me she signed it. Tell her it's for the family. She always caves when you talk about family, Dad. Tell her I'm going to lose everything if she doesn't do this." Gerald looked at me, his eyes cold and calculating, enjoying the performance. "You heard her, Caitlin. This isn't a request anymore. If you don't sign that quitclaim deed right now, I've already instructed Brennan to file the paperwork with the county court. We will challenge your competency. We have the fabricated records from your unstable period after your deployment. We will prove you aren't fit to manage your own affairs, let alone a piece of prime real estate. The judge will strip your rights, and I will be appointed as your legal conservator. You sign now, or you lose everything, including your military career." He was using the weaponized mental health card again, trying to bury my reputation under the weight of his lies. He thought the threat of a public scandal would make a captain in the United States Army retreat. He truly believed he was the only one in the room with a tactical plan. He had no idea he had just walked into a pre-sighted kill zone. I didn't blink. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single, thick folder. On the front, the red embossed seal of the county clerk caught the light, gleaming like a fresh wound. I didn't throw it. I didn't move fast. I placed the document face down on the mahogany, and using one finger, I slid it slowly across the table until it came to a stop directly under Lawyer Brennan's nose. "This," I said, my voice cutting through Meredith's whining on the phone like a serrated blade, "is a certified copy of the Irrevocable Trust established by Howard Poole 7 years ago. The property at 14 Cedar Mill Road was moved into this trust 3 years before he passed away. I am the sole beneficiary. The trustee is not you, Gerald. It is Lawyer Calloway in Nashville." The room went so silent I could hear the hum of the air conditioner. Brennan's hand was trembling as he reached for the document. He pulled it toward him, his eyes darting across the pages with frantic intensity. He took off his glasses, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he realized the magnitude of the situation. Gerald, meanwhile, was still wearing that smug, Ralph Lauren smile, though it was beginning to fray at the edges like old fabric. "What is that?" Gerald demanded, his voice rising in pitch. "Some fake military nonsense. I have the deed in my name. I checked it years ago." Brennan looked up, and for the first time, he looked truly terrified of the woman sitting across from him. "Mr. Poole?" Be quiet, the lawyer whispered, his voice cracking with unprofessional panic. This is an irrevocable trust. If this is legitimate, and it appears to be, you never owned 14 Cedar Mill Road. It was never part of the estate you inherited. It was legally separated from your reach nearly a decade ago. Gerald's face went from a deep, arrogant purple to a deathly, translucent white. He lunged forward, snatching the paper from Brennan's hands, his eyes wild as they scanned the bold, black type. "This is impossible!" he screamed, the sound finally cracking his expensive facade. The old man was senile. He couldn't have done this behind my back. He didn't have the brains to set this up. I leaned forward, placing my elbows on the table and lacing my fingers together. I waited until his eyes met mine, eyes that were now filled with the frantic, desperate terror of a man who realized the ground had just vanished beneath his feet. "He didn't do it behind your back, Gerald," I said, my words falling like heavy stones into a still pond. "He did it to protect me from you. He knew exactly who you were. He knew that the moment he was gone, you would try to bleed me dry to feed Meredith's vanity. He set the safety catch 7 years ago, and you just pulled the trigger on yourself. You didn't just lie to me, Gerald. You tried to sell an asset that doesn't belong to you for $320,000. In this state, that's not a family dispute. That's felony property fraud and wire fraud. And as of 10 minutes ago, Lawyer Calloway has already notified the district attorney." Gerald slumped back into his leather chair, the Ralph Lauren shirt suddenly looking 3 sizes too big for him. The patriarchal monument he had built on lies didn't just fall, it shattered into a million pieces of useless paper. Meredith was still crying on the phone, her voice a distant, pathetic squeak, but nobody was listening anymore. I stood up, gripped my briefcase, and looked down at the broken man who used to be my father. "Checkmate, Gerald," I whispered. "You should have checked the perimeter before you started a war with the logistics officer." The notification from my neighbor, Mrs. Higgins, arrived at 4 o'clock that afternoon. It was a short, frantic text with a blurred photo attached. Gerald's silver SUV and Meredith's white convertible were parked haphazardly on the lawn of the lake house, trampling the grass I had preserved. They had used the old emergency spare key hidden under the porch, a key I had forgotten, to walk through the front door and begin an illegal occupation of my property. By 5 o'clock, Meredith had already posted a photo on Facebook. She was sitting in Grandpa Howard's hand-carved Adirondack chair on the deck, holding an expensive Chardonnay with a fake, serene smile. Her caption read, "Family time at the lake. No matter who tries to tear us apart, blood is thicker than water." Finally, home. They weren't just visiting, they were digging in like a hostile force. They thought that by physically being there, they could invoke some twisted version of squatters' rights, or, more likely, shame me into a compromise. They believed that if they made enough noise about family unity, I would eventually hand over the keys and the deed just to make the headache go away. They had spent decades betting on my resilience, assuming I would always be the one to bend so they didn't have to break. Daniel stood beside me in our kitchen as I looked at the screen, his fingers stained with grease and his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. He gripped a heavy steel wrench so tightly his knuckles turned white. "How do you want to execute this, Caitlin?" he asked, his voice low and vibrating with a protective fury. "We can drive down there right now and physically remove them." I shook my head, my eyes cold and fixed on the image of Meredith sitting in my grandfather's chair. "No," I said, my voice as sharp as a bayonet. "We don't get our hands dirty. We use the system Grandpa built to protect us. We conduct a legal airstrike." I picked up the phone and dialed Lawyer Calloway, the trustee. My instructions were brief and devoid of emotion. I told him to issue an immediate 72-hour eviction notice for 3 trespassers at 14 Cedar Mill Road. I told him that if they weren't gone by the deadline, he was to coordinate with the county sheriff for a forced removal. I wasn't negotiating, I was clearing the perimeter. At 6:47 the next morning, my phone erupted. It was Diane. She didn't lead with an apology or an explanation. She went straight for the ultimate weapon in the American mother's arsenal, the guilt trip. Her voice was a high-pitched, hysterical wail that made my ear ache. "How could you do this, Caitlin? Are you really trying to kill your own mother? She screamed, the sound of her heavy, ragged breathing filling the line. Your father is a prominent man in this town. You are going to humiliate him in front of everyone. The military has turned you into a heartless monster. Have you forgotten everything we did for you? You're going to push your own parents out onto the street like common criminals? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't defend my service. I simply waited for her to take a breath. I'm not taking anything from you, Diane, I said, using her name for the first time. I am simply reclaiming what is mine. You have 48 hours left. I suggest you pack the trash you brought in before the sheriff arrives to do it for you. I hung up before she could respond, the silence that followed feeling like a victory. 2 days later, at the stroke of noon, a county sheriff's patrol car pulled into the gravel driveway of the lake house. The presence of the law was absolute. I sat in my truck at the end of the road, watching through the windshield. Gerald was the first one out. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. He wasn't the powerful bank manager in the Ralph Lauren shirt anymore. He was a man being evicted from a house he had tried to steal. He was lugging heavy, overstuffed suitcases toward his SUV, his face twisted in a mask of silent, impotent rage. Meredith followed behind him, her designer sunglasses hiding her defeat. The most satisfying part wasn't the police presence, it was the audience. Mrs. Higgins and several other neighbors were standing on their porches, their arms crossed, watching the entire shameful retreat. These were the people Gerald had lied to for years, telling them I was unstable and ungrateful. Now they were seeing the truth. They saw a man who had tried to illegally occupy his daughter's property being escorted off by the authorities. The Poole family facade didn't just crack, it vanished into the Tennessee wind. The dominoes fell the moment the lake house was secured. Without the $320,000 windfall from the house sale, Gerald's desperate plan to save Meredith's boutique shattered. 2 weeks later, the bank officially seized her store, the closed sign on the window a final testament to her incompetence. Gerald had no more moves left. He was forced to sell his beloved F-150 truck just to stay afloat. But even that wasn't enough. He had to drain his entire $401k retirement fund, incurring a massive tax penalty that gutted his life savings. He had to pay back the $140,000 debt he had taken on to cover for Meredith. His dream of retiring at 62 was dead. He would be working at the bank until he was 70, haunted by the debt and the lingering whispers of the town. He had gambled everything on my silence, and he had lost. I was finally free of the shadows, and the Pooles were finally living in the reality they had built for themselves. The air at 14 Cedar Mill Road finally tasted like oxygen again. A week after the sheriff had escorted the last of the Poole toxicity from the premises, Daniel and I returned to begin the real work of reclamation. The house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the lingering, greasy residue of people who didn't belong here. We spent the first 48 hours ripping down the gaudy, floral wallpaper that Meredith had slapped over the original wood. A desperate attempt to mark her territory on a land she never earned. Every strip of paper I peeled back felt like a layer of skin being healed. Underneath the artificial patterns, the sturdy, honest pine was still there, waiting for the light. By Saturday afternoon, I found myself in the back corner of the dusty garage. It was a space Gerald had ignored because it didn't hold anything he could sell. Amidst the rusted gardening tools and cobwebs, I spotted a water-damaged cardboard box. Inside, buried under old tax returns, was a leather-bound photo album I hadn't seen since I was 10 years old. As I lifted the heavy cover, a single, loose photograph slid out and landed on the concrete floor. I picked it up, and my breath hitched. It was a Polaroid from 1998. I was 6 years old, sitting high on Grandpa Howard's broad shoulders, my small hands gripping his ears for balance. I was holding a bright yellow plastic fishing pole, and he was laughing, a wide, genuine roar of a laugh that I could almost hear through the faded ink. He was holding my legs so tightly, ensuring I wouldn't fall. For 2 decades, my parents had tried to convince me that I was a secondary character, a backup plan, a cactus that didn't need water. But that photo was the only intelligence I needed to debunk their lies. I wasn't born to be a tool. I was born to be loved, and once, by a man who actually understood the meaning of the word, I truly was. I tucked the photo into the breast pocket of my work shirt, right against my heart, and walked out of the garage. The outside world, however, wasn't letting go as easily. My phone had become a battlefield of incoming notifications from the very people who had watched me be crucified in silence on Christmas night. Now that the truth of the irrevocable trust was out and Gerald's fraud was the talk of the county, the flying monkeys were circling. Aunt Linda sent 3 separate texts, her tone shifting from accusatory to pathetic. "I was lied to, Caitlin," she wrote. "We all thought you were the one being difficult. We're family, honey. Please don't let a house destroy us." I didn't feel anger when I read it. I didn't feel the need to explain or litigate the past. I simply swiped left and hit delete. I was executing a no-contact order, not out of malice, but as a tactical necessity. In the military, you don't keep an open line to a source that has been compromised. That evening, I sat at the small kitchen table and pulled out a single sheet of stationery. I didn't write a manifesto. I didn't ask for apologies I knew would be hollow. I wrote a short, sharp note addressed to Gerald and Diane. "The rules of engagement for my life have changed," I wrote, my pen carving deep into the paper. "The door to this house is not locked because of hate. It is locked because it is a sanctuary for those who provide respect and truth. You are welcome to walk through it when you can arrive as parents who recognize my worth rather than debtors looking for a bailout. Until then, the perimeter remains closed." I sealed the envelope, applied a stamp, and walked it down to the mailbox. I lifted the red flag. The message was sent. Daniel was waiting for me by the porch, leaning against the railing as he watched the local carpenters finish repairing the wooden steps Gerald had scuffed during his exit. He walked over and wrapped his arms around me, his chin resting on my shoulder. His presence was a constant, grounded warmth that reminded me I'd built my own platoon from scratch. "They're still going to call you the villain of this story, you know?" he whispered. I nodded, watching the sun begin to dip toward the tree line. "I know. They'll call me cold. They'll call me ungrateful. They'll probably tell the whole town I'm the crazy one who kicked her aging parents out." "Does it bother you?" he asked. I looked at the sentry post I had established, the physical and emotional boundaries that now protected my peace. "No," I said, and for the first time, I meant it. "A boundary isn't a wall built out of hate, Daniel. It's a guard post, and I'm the only one who holds the keys. I've spent 28 years trying to earn a seat at their table. I'm finally realizing that I own the whole damn lake." I walked down the sloping lawn, past the pine trees, until my boots hit the weathered wood of the dock. The lake was a sheet of glass, reflecting the deep, bruised purples and fiery oranges of the Tennessee sunset. I sat down in Grandpa Howard's green Adirondack chair, the one Meredith had tried to claim, and felt the cool breeze off the water against my face. I took a slow sip of the steaming tea in my hand, the heat spreading through my chest. I am Captain Caitlin Poole. I am a wife, I am a homeowner, I am a survivor. They called me the resilient one because they thought it meant I could take an infinite amount of abuse and still keep standing. They were wrong. My resilience wasn't a permit for their cruelty. It was the fuel I needed to burn their bridges and build my own bridge to the light. I watched the last sliver of the sun vanish behind the hills, leaving a trail of gold on the water. The war was over. The perimeter was secure. And for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I was home. As we close the book on Captain Caitlin Poole, I want to share a vital lesson that this story leaves behind. True resilience isn't just about your ability to absorb hits, it is about the strategic courage to draw a line in the sand. Caitlin's journey proved that family is a title earned through mutual respect, not a biological right to exploit or destroy. Choosing your mental health over toxic genetic ties isn't an act of hate. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. I believe your worth is never defined by those who fail to see it, but by the peace you refuse to let them break. Caitlin finally secured her perimeter and found her home. And now I want to hear from the real heroes, you. Are you currently holding the keys to your own sentry post? Or are you still fighting to build those necessary boundaries? I want this channel to be a sanctuary for the resilient ones. If this finale gave you the strength to stand tall, please hit that like button right now. Do you believe no contact is the ultimate form of self-care? Share your perspective and comment home below. Make sure you are subscribed so you never miss our next journey. Thank you for being here with me.